Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new, welcome. I am Courtney and I'm a final year PhD student at Imperial College London. And in today's video, I'm going to be covering some tips for conducting your literature review. I recently did a video on how to get started with writing a research paper, but I wanted to go a bit more in depth on some tips for one of the really key areas of a research paper and a thesis, which is the literature review. The literature review is really the starting point for your thesis, your dissertation, your research paper. It is where you're going to find the gaps and figure out exactly where your research is going to fit into a larger body of research. The literature review is actually the divergence to converge. So you spend a period of time reading the existing literature, meaning that in the literature review, nothing you put in there should really be new, but it should be based on what already exists. Now, an important point to make sure that your literature review is the best that it can be and gets a really great score is to remember that the literature review is not just a regurgitation of what you've read, but rather it's a critical analysis of the existing literature. And by critical analysis, what I mean is you're critiquing the work, you're looking for the gaps in the work, the way in which you write the literature review would be critical. It would be looking at ways to improve. If you're looking at methodologies, it will be saying whether something was done well. That is the type of approach you would take to a literature review, so that it's not just definitions, but rather thinking about the literature in a critical sense and you identifying how you're going to contribute to your work. So for example, if you're trying to buy an item, you look at, you know the specs, but you look and you compare the specs. So one way in which you can make your literature review more critical is by comparing different schools of thoughts, different approaches to the same topic that you are doing. How do you even get started with your literature review? Well, first of all, you need to understand what type of literature review you need to do, whether it's a narrative literature review, a systematic literature review, meta-analysis literature review. I'm quite familiar with narrative literature review, which is where, for example, you do different methodologies that have been applied, schools of thought, and then there's also the ones that merge different fields. For example, I am working on climate finance, climate adaptation finance, and that merges private investment, capital markets, climate finance, climate science. So I'm working on boundary of all of these 4 topics, and I need to cover these in my work. But then there's systematic reviews, which take a lot longer time. You need to be as thorough as possible, and then there are also meta-analysis. So getting started requires you to understand which type of literature review is expected of you. Once you identify the type of literature review that you're going to be doing, the next step is to get an idea of what you need to start talking about in that review. So the basics would be to gather those 4 terms. So for me, it would be capital markets, private sector investment, climate finance, climate change adaptation. And I'll start reading around those areas, but reading around the ones that are most relevant to climate financing. And then I will streamline that. I'll start doing a search on all of those and collecting papers. Now, to find those papers, you can use different websites such as Scopus, Web of Science, and Google Scholar. There's several other search engines that you can use. But you should generally try to find academic literature, peer-reviewed literature for your literature review. Unless, of course, your subject area is so novel, is one of those developing fields that you have to read a lot of grey literature. So within each of these papers, you need to start identifying the key terms that are relevant for your work. When you're reading, as I said, you have to be very critical. So you're identifying gaps, you're identifying shortfalls, you're identifying how you can contribute, and pick out those key terms that really help to communicate what you want to do, and make sure that those are clearly stated, defined, explained in the context of your research in that literature review. Now, coming back to what the literature review is, a divergence to converge, and this is really evident in the structure of your literature review. So what you want to do in the structure is give a broad overview of what the topic you're covering is, and then slowly take the reader through the topic, getting narrower and narrower, focusing specifically on what you want to address in your thesis, in your dissertation. And then I talk about my hypothesis. The hypothesis would be based on all that I've read. How would I answer my research question? So start broad, and end up narrow. Now, in executing your literature review, one of the things to be really mindful of, whether it be your PhD student, a master's student, or if it's just a short project that you're working on, that literature review is something that you should try to make sure that you take good notes and have good record of what you've read. It's really important to capture all that you've read and keep track of what you're reading, because as I said before, the literature review is that divergence and then you have to converge. So in diverging, you can get really lost going down a rabbit hole of papers. So what I would suggest in terms of executing the literature review and making sure that you have all the information is to create a database of papers that you're going to read. Have that database, get an Excel spreadsheet. After you've done your literature search, you take a note of the author, the paper, and just a quick summary of what that paper is about and the relevance to your research, whether it be it's a particular topic that you're covering in a literature review, etc. And then also keep note of the years, because sometimes your literature review needs to be within a certain time frame. So to avoid going down that rabbit hole of papers, reading too many papers, you need to do two things. One, be very selective in the papers you choose to read. A way to navigate this is to just read the abstract, read the conclusion, and see the method that they use. And look for the keywords as well that are on the paper that will give you a guide to what to expect in a paper. Instead of spending all day reading papers, you can just do those three things to just get a quick gist and a sense of what the paper is. So be very selective, choose your papers wisely. And secondly, in terms of avoiding going down the rabbit hole, set targets and deadlines for your literature review. There's so much literature out there, there's an abundance of literature, and you can end up spending a long time reading, but you need to make sure that you have the key ideas and you don't spend too long in the literature review phase, because then you're going to lose time when it matters doing your research, doing your experiments, etc. Now that takes me into my third tip, which covers the database as well, but get yourself a reference manager. And a reference manager helps you to keep track of the papers that you have read, but most importantly, it helps you when you are writing in terms of inserting your references and citations in the format that is required by your university. So some common reference managers are Mendeley and Zotero, and those are really handy for keeping the papers that you have. Most of them have storage limit, but you can store a certain amount of papers, sync it to your cloud drive, and then you can also make notes within the referencing software, referencing manager, that allows you to then go back and always have an idea of what that paper was about. Effective and good notes are going to save you a lot of time when you are writing up. A referencing manager would really save you a lot of time in referencing and generating your bibliography and making sure that you do not plagiarize. It has saved me a lot in the past, because I did submit a paper a couple minutes before the deadline and I realized I did not have my bibliography done, but after I just had to press generate bibliography, and voila, my bibliography was done and I resubmitted. Those are some of my tips on writing your literature review, getting started, having an efficient process, and how to structure it. And I hope this was helpful. If it was, please give it a thumbs up. Leave any questions you have down below and I'll be happy to address them in another video. And you can always head over to my Instagram as well, where I give daily tips and share my journey as a PhD student. Alright, until next video, bye bye.